Well, after Dee left, we lost our expediter, and so we just filled our way
How in the
around.
world did you make it home? I don't
for a
know.
while, yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, let's turn this over
And
here a little bit so we can.
so we traveled around India a bit more. Went to some remarkable archaeological sites, some old Stone Age caves, Ellora and Ajanta, and some other sites, and then wanted to visit Nepal. And we got into the Terai, the lowlands, and the road had washed out. And so we were never able to go to Nepal as most people know it. But at the same time, we're so struck by just the gentleness and the kindness and so on of the Nepalese. And so we remained there for a short period of time, and then came down to Calcutta. And it was interesting. Calcutta, of course, is an enormous city, and the contrast again from the sort of the gentleness and so on of the Nepalese was quite a contrast. There was some sort of a decision made on the part of officials in Calcutta that we may have been trying to sell the vehicle, to sell cameras, sell equipment, and so on. And we were staying at a Salvation Army hostel, and they were just wonderful, and they took care of the whole thing. And we
Meaning they convinced the officials that you were not merchanting off your stuff here
right.
for profit. Okay.
Right.
Wow.
And so we moved on, but we had hoped to travel overland, and we weren't able to do that. Part of the problem was Burma, Myanmar, Burma at the time, and the I mean, obviously it's quite a chunk of that area, and we were only able to remain in the country for 24 hours. And so we flew in on the Union of Burma Airlines, and it was just a wonderful airline. It was two props, but had these amazing food and generosity, and twice the baggage. I think it was 20 kilos at the time. They gave us 40 kilos, yeah. And it was just a wonderful experience. Then flew into Rangoon, and it was very colonial. I mean, the sort of these old white stucco sort of business buildings and so on. It had this very isolated, it was almost like stepping back into the 1950s or 60s. And we stayed at YMCA, and it was interesting that night. People came to visit us, and one of them was, I believe he was a Shan tribesman from the north that were a persecuted minority, and he was a teacher, and he spoke excellent English and so on. And he had a mock-up of a newspaper that he wanted to publish. And it was not in English. And so I, of course, had no idea who he was in the greater scheme of things or what the newspaper was all about. And so he asked if I would deliver this mock-up of this newspaper to a princess in Thailand. And
one of your longtime friends,
yeah, right.
acquaintances, yeah, of course.
And so we sort of hid it in my suitcase, and traveled on and did deliver it. Burma was a fascinating country with all of its many problems, and I of course was there for a very short period of time. And so I was mostly introduced to its cuisine and so on, which was just wonderful. It was sort of a mix of Indian, Chinese, and so on. But then moved on to Thailand and looked up the princess and delivered the newspaper. And I, in retrospect, was wondering how risky actually was that? Who was this? And so we're in Thailand for a period of time and traveled overland most of the time. And Bangkok was just fascinating architecturally. The temples, the 3 temples in a row, and Hindu, Buddhist, and so on.
If I can interrupt, you said you were traveling overland. Was this with a vehicle, or did you unload the vehicle earlier?
Oh, we shipped it from Calcutta.
Okay.
And so, yeah.
Traveling by public transportation now.
And so we took the Union of Burma airline here, then Air Vietnam to Thailand. And it was, again, a fairly short stay. Bangkok is a fascinating city. And it was a wonderful visit, but I was struck again by the reclining Buddha and the temples and so on. There was a sort of a sacredness about it at that time. And like all cities, it's become, I've dealt with it more recently, much busier and so on. It's sort of lost that, as I'm sure is true of Jerusalem and other places I've been. We traveled on then overland by rail to Cambodia and to the archaeological sites, Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom. And again, the people were just the nicest people. And I was so struck by years later and looking back, and you have the killing fields and all of this, and you just wonder how this could happen. Some of the other people that I remember as being so kind and gentle were the Sudanese. Yeah. And again, we have all of that tension. And it's been interesting, and I've run into this in Tajikistan and other places, where there will be some terrible period of death and destruction and division and so on, and the people just don't really notice, and move on. Yeah. And I understand the Cambodians again have collected their wits about them and are living happily and peacefully together. We then traveled on with Air Vietnam to Saigon, and it was interesting when going into the city. There was this large military cemetery, and I noticed that the grave markers were Islamic. They were Muslim, and what had happened was the French had been using Moroccan and Senegalese soldiers to fight their war for them in Vietnam. Went into the city, and I don't remember a great deal about what I remember mostly was going into the city, and we consulted USAID, and I found Thelma Huber, which was she was the home economics teacher in my high school, and she was teaching there with the Agency for International Development, and so we. I remember having gone up onto the rooftop of a hotel that was sort of popular, and people would go up there and have a drink or do whatever. But it was interesting because what the entertainment was, it was the mortars that were being lobbed out of the city. And so you'd have these, and what they were doing, they didn't want concentrations of Viet Cong. So our visit to Saigon, we were only in Saigon. One couldn't travel about in Vietnam at that time. Was relatively short, and it was interesting, and decisions were being made, and we had these sort of academic types who were determining whether we should be there or what we should be doing there, and the general consensus was they seemed almost indifferent to it. And I think that it comes from this kind of a European white supremacist view that this is the third world and we can do what we want. But it was interesting that obviously the Vietnam War began in earnest. Our participation at about that time. We then flew to Hong Kong. And Hong Kong was fascinating. It was, it's of course a business center, but it really has a sort of behind the walls and so on, little fishing villages and sort of a different aspect to it, a different life, and it was very interesting. And then we were hoping to leave then to move on to Japan and out of the United States. And there was a typhoon and they couldn't leave. They couldn't, the planes couldn't fly. And finally, they decided to risk it. And so we took a Air Vietnam flight out of there, and they flew French Caravels. Their passenger planes relatively small. And I was so interested because they were concerned about a normal departure and then gaining altitude and so on. But they went straight up. And I was thinking, I couldn't imagine how they did that, because they didn't want to fly out over the countryside. And so we continued on, and that was Hong Kong. Then on from Hong Kong, took CAT, which was a Taiwanian airline, and flew to Okinawa. And it was interesting because the typhoon was still active, and so they were trying to straighten out the plane so when it hit the tarmac, that it would be stable. It'd
lined
go
up to go forward. Yeah.
And so that was exciting. And so then we went on, flew into Japan, and there had some really wonderful experiences. I mean, it's certainly the architecture was very interesting and so on. The first night we're there, what I remember was having been served a meal. We were in a tea house with just sort of paper walls and so on. It was just where we're staying and eating. And then this food is brought out. I didn't recognize a single thing that was brought. And I don't know what they were, sea cucumbers, different soy preparations perhaps or something. It was delicious. It was wonderful, but I was really struck by the uniqueness of the cuisine. And for people now with sushi and so on, they'd be old stuff probably, but and then I remember early in the morning went down to the docks where the fishermen had come in, and most places where I've dealt with fish, they're fish and they put them out but the Japanese, they were by size and they were all marked, and it was just so methodical and so well organized. And So the markets were interesting, the architecture was interesting, and we stayed there at it was a sort of a Quaker hostel, and enjoyed our stay. But we were there in August, and we had thought we'd go to Kyoto or different areas of Japan that'd be of interest. Everyone is off in August, apparently. It's like France, isn't it? And we couldn't get a ticket to go any place. So we just walked around Tokyo and then finally left. And it was interesting. Took the Japan Airlines as you had. And it was a wonderful flight, and passing the international date line, we got our chopsticks and different things, and came into San Francisco. And what I remember about San Francisco was greeted by Jim Kleinbach and so on. But I got dysentery. I had not had that problem since the entire trip. Or I hadn't even been ill, I don't think, on the entire trip. And what I think it was chlorinated water that had somehow killed the wrong, microorganisms in my system, and the more aggressive ones then said, well, it was a clear shot. Let's go to it. Anyway. That and then
couldn't handle that American food anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
So
you landed back in San Francisco roughly when? I got back there 4th of July. You got in there when?
It was late August.
Late August.
And
so almost 2 months later. Yeah.
So yeah. And it was interesting. Went back down to the Valley de Mesa and tried to figure out what I was going to do. And Bill Cousins, not Bill Cousins, Bob Russell, who was in charge of our Peace Corps training, the reservation business, had become the head of it's called the Indian Community Action Section of the Office of Economic Opportunity so he hired me as his assistant. And so I worked for the Indian Community Action Section for a period of time, and then, as you know, I hadn't completed my undergraduate degree yet, so I then went to Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and finished my undergraduate degree, and then tried to figure out, as you had, what to do once you have this sheepskin in your hand. What do you do with it? And I came back to Mesa and thought about it for a while, and applied then to Chicago and Harvard and got in, and then had this choice. And in our family, the elitism of Harvard did not appeal to them at all. Chicago did, because our family has a long history with Chicago. But Chicago also had the leading geography department in the country, the leading anthropology department. And so it just made sense. And I went to Chicago then and completed the master's. Didn't complete the master's. I took the thesis with me, but the university at some point no longer required it, and so they gave me my degree when I was in Africa, one story was they hadn't heard from me, and so they thought I'd been killed. And so they thought that they're giving me my degree posthumously. But it was interesting then, was wanted to go back to Africa. I really found Chad particularly interesting because of the sort of the advance of Islam, and then the Christian and various indigenous religions, the animistic religions and so on. And there was a kind of an interesting dynamic going on. But Yvonne had of course been a Peace Corps volunteer in Cameroon, the neighboring country. And so it seemed perfect that she had French. So returned to the States, worked for the Office of Economic Opportunity, and then went on to Berkeley. And I'd known Yvonne for several years. We had both been in student government together at different high schools. She was in Phoenix. But we had remained in contact, and I had my mother kind of keep track of her. Excuse me. And she did. And so anyway, then she had a year after I'd gone to Iran. She went to Cameroon with Peace Corps. And then at Berkeley, she was off in Middlebury with her graduate work. And so we corresponded. And then we found ourselves in Phoenix Mesa together, and did the same thing that you had done with churches would invite us. Peace Corps was new, and people were very much interested in it. And so she was involved in Peace Corps training, and I was then at Chicago, and she came up to Chicago. Excuse me. And apparently had, in part at least, been my brother Fritz was teaching at LSU at the time, and basically sort of center, you know, of there. So anyway, we went back and to announce our engagement, and Dad said, "Well, what's the point? Why don't you just get married and have 12 boys, and we'll move?" So we did, and
got married part, not the 12 boys.
Married,
got married, yeah.
not 12 boys.
Yeah,
a couple of them. And then we went back to Chicago, and then on to
put that around where you're talking about.
my doctoral work in. It was in Chad.
Chad, moved back here.
Here, and we remained there for a period of years, 2 years with Fulbright grant, and then we wanted to stay longer because of the drought, and I was dealing with the periodic inundation of Lake Chad, the cultural ecology.
That would expand out, come back.
Yeah, right.
Except that year, it didn't expand.
It didn't expand.
Yeah.
And so I was sort of waiting for the lake to behave properly. And so Yvonne was she was engaged in all kinds of things. She was sort of a escort interpreter, translator for the United Nations, and was dealing with Peace Corps language training and different things. But one of the things she found herself doing was doing translation work and so on for a visiting businessman from Agricola Metals Corporation in New Jersey. And so he hired us to run Agricola du Chad. And so she was the administrative director, and I was the technical director of Agricola du Chad, which is the gum arabic monopoly for the Republic of Chad. And it was just this most incredible experience. And I had It used to be in the program was managed by the armed forces.
Whose armed forces? The U.S.
Chadian.
Chadian. Okay.
Chadian. And the local population didn't respond to that at all. They were Arab, and the armed forces in Chad were basically Southerners, Southern Christian, and so I reorganized it completely along. We had sultans that were serving as governors or prefets. And so reorganized it around these individuals, and so we had sort of these dominant figures, and then the regional chefs and the chef de village, the village chiefs, and so on. And we're able to quadruple production in 1 year. These guys really,
Wow.
I mean, they were incredibly capable and energetic, but what had happened was that they realized that they were the beneficiaries of what they were doing, of their work, because before so much of the money would seep off into various nooks and crannies, and so it was just this really interesting experience, but realizing that we could, even in rebel-held territories, we'd send camel trains back in to bring the gum out because we would lose the trucks to the rebels. And it was just realized that it was a completely indigenous operation, except we would then put the gum on Air Afrique and fly it to France and Germany. But that was really interesting. And then the revolution in 1975 brought that to an end. And flew back, and Will, again, our traveling companion,
Will Louden.
wanted to go back to the ranch. And he was teaching museum technology, anthropology, and geology at Trinidad State Community College. And so he asked if I would be interested in taking his place so that he could go back to the ranch. And since I had nothing else to do, took it. He took him up on
Why
it.
not?
Yeah. And it was interesting. It was a little bit like your geography in Beecher City. I had there was no geography program at Trinidad State, so I created the geography program, and then I taught all the courses in anthropology and geology, and I taught physical science, and I was the curator of the museum and ran the program in natural hazards for the county. And I was exhausted
I can't imagine why.
I was sort of taking this all very seriously and getting very little sleep, and was totally incompetent. I'd never taught before.
All these things were new ventures. You have to figure out how to do them as you were doing them.
So anyway, it was a very interesting experience, and I thought a really valuable experience because I was able to try a lot of different things out.
Yeah. How many years were you there?
Let's see, 3.
3 years. Okay.
And this was when I called upon Leslie Dee Fink to provide me with information on how to manage this stuff. And so we did that with little groups and different things. I did as well as I was able to do it. Gilbert White, then from the University of Chicago, was then at the University of Colorado, and he really didn't think that I should be at Trinidad State. And so I had applied for a position at the University of Maryland, and it was successful. And then I still didn't have my doctorate. And it was Baltimore County campus, which was
UMBC.
And then I was also recruited by the National Academy of Sciences and I'd already accepted the Maryland position, and the people in Baltimore said, just it's fine, go.
Go work for the National Council.
They said you'd be foolish not to take that, and so we thought, well, a couple of years, Washington would be fine, and it went on for obviously over a decade, and it was just the most interesting work that in which I'd been engaged, and it was.
In general, what was the scope of that job?
It began with Sahel. I directed the Sahel program.
At the southern edge of the Sahara Desert.
Yeah. So of course the Chad experience was relevant.
So what was it, this Sahel project that you were developing, what was the general purpose of it? Was it just to do research and get information about the area, or was it to try to develop it, or what?
It was really trying to provide information for governments and various organizations to intervene in restoring the livelihood systems in the region. And so they're
related to the drought that had been going on.
To the drought, yeah.
Okay.
And so I had done a lot of this sort of historical environmental change work. And then what was interesting, because I didn't really understand the influence of the Academy in a way. And all of a sudden found myself in this position of going to German GTZ and asking them if they would do this, and Swiss DDA if they would do that, and so on. So we had this in Orstam of the French and so on. And it was really interesting because it was just sort of collaborative, and we actually got quite a bit done. And with the UNESCO, we're able to develop a microbiological resources center to inoculate the trees and shrubs, the leguminous trees and shrubs, and so on. And so then that expanded into my work there was still at the Academy with this grants program, large grants program, and that took us really literally all over the non-industrialized world. And that was a program in which we basically, it was highly competitive, but they did the work, and I would simply come to evaluate, help, do whatever I could with regard to forestry, but directed the forestry sector.
So what years were you with this Academy program?
It was 1978 to 1981. No, 78 to, let's see, it was 1990.
About 90, okay.
About. And I should have mentioned that there also, with regard to the family, by this time we were dealing with the family, but I had studied, well as at Berkeley, I studied at Lund University in Sweden as well. And then Switzerland, because the family was Swiss, and so did my French training there. And Yvonne had been at Neuchâtel in Fribourg as well as a student. And so in coming to do the dissertation work, I really can't leave this out. She traveled across the Sahara Desert with a 1-year-old on her lap, and she was pregnant.
With the second one coming, yeah.
And
so across the Sahara Desert.
Drove down, and that was my introduction to this region. But after the
so you crossed the Sahara a second time, having done it on the trip once,
right.
And then later crossed it by land, a little further east,
right.
with a wife, a child, and one coming.
And it was interesting. It was with the forestry program, forestry research. It was a little bit like your experience. Here we had given grants to Thailand to any number of countries throughout Tunisia, Morocco, and so on. So, in a sense, we're going back over the map in a way that you and I had years earlier. Then with the Academy, I was a little bit concerned that what the Academy does and what I was doing is advisory. And we had been more active than literally almost any Academy program had ever. We had species trials and all kinds of things, and we're cooperating. I had developed agricultural systems that actually perform better in drought than if the rains came. Tarahumara runner beans and Australian channel millet and a number of tepary beans and Pima Papago 60-day maize and so on. And they would perform because they were stressed by the drought, and so they would be productive, more productive. And I'd learned that really from the gum arabic. When, for example, the European community had put in a gum arabic plantation not far from mine, but they wanted to be sure that it's well watered, and there was no gum arabic. The trees just grew, and the reason was they weren't stressed. And gum arabic is a stress product.
You learn the result of the value of stress and how to be. But now let me. So where was your dissertation? That was kind of a hanging story here. Did you finish it up on this trip or later on, or when was that?
It was.
I mean, you're doing all these incredible things without it, so you didn't need it.
But when we left Chad, there had just been the coup d'etat, and all of my dissertation material was confiscated. And so I had to come back, and there was this delay at the Academy, and the University of Chicago said, well, why don't we submit, since you didn't need a thesis for your MA, why don't you just submit that as a PhD? And Chicago said, well, that isn't exactly what he said he was going to do, It's completely different. It was pre-Achaemenid history and so on. So they just didn't limit my time. They allowed me to go on and submit a different thesis, but it had to be related to international development, and it had to be related to this part of Africa. So what they finally did was, I'd written a book on environmental degradation in Mauritania, and so I basically took that book and expanded it to the entire region, and that became another book on sort of human role in environmental change in West Africa. But that's what they accepted then as a dissertation.
As a dissertation, yeah, okay. And so that happened roughly when?
It happened probably late-ish, mid-'80s.
Okay.
And
so in the middle of this whole work with the Academy.
And I was a little, the World Resources Institute was sort of, it had geared up, and it was becoming more active in implementing projects and things of this nature. So I felt that the Academy, even though what I was doing was relatively active, it was still advisory. I wasn't there doing anything. And so went over to the World Resources Institute and directed their Africa program. And it turned out to be a very political organization.
Active.
And it came out of the Carter administration, and it had just come off the oil shocks. And so it was all about energy and sort of energy conservation and alternative energy.
How can we keep petroleum coming into the West?
And so it wasn't really a particularly good fit. And so I was thinking of going back to academia at that time, and and Yvonne, being a Montanan, was anxious to go back to Montana, and so we looked about, and I was offered positions at Stanford and University of California at Santa Cruz, and so on, but they didn't have geography departments. And so I would be in some place in development studies or whatever. At Stanford, it was biological sciences, and because of the environmental history and so on. And so a position opened up, the directorship of the Public Policy Research Institute at the University of Montana, and so we took that. And that was in, well, it was 81.
81?
91.
Excuse me. Yeah, I think you're a little further.
It was
91.
89, 90.
Okay.
And then have been at the University of Montana ever since, and remained with the Public Policy Research Institute for about 20 years. And then sort of slid over into the Department of Geography and chaired that department, and then chaired Asian Studies at the same time. So I actually had these 3 different programs going, and then eventually it just became geography. And that's where I am now. Parallel to that was, from 1980 on, was work with the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and that also was environmental change work and so on.
But you retired then from Montana when?
Not yet.
Oh, you're still there. Okay, I thought you retired.
No, I'm formally retired. They said you can keep your office and just
okay.
keep working. It's just that we won't pay you.
Okay. Oh well, no, well, fair enough.